a Sankarshan Joshi trip.
First of all, Apurva, welcome back. I am
Thank you
so
so much.
happy to have you back. I was
I'm extremely happy and honored to be back as well.
I was super excited. Like I was super pumped up when you agreed to do this, because I think there were a couple of instances where I thought of you, and then where I thought of what you said the last time when you were here on the podcast. Like the first thing was, I remember you telling. We had a conversation about people wanting to seek attention, like people want attention, like attention seeking people, and then you rephrased it like people are seeking attention because they're lacking love somewhere else in their home. So like from when I this has been in my head, the way how I see people has entirely changed. Like there is no hard feelings when I see people, and thank you for saying that last time you here. Like that's been predominantly impacted how I see things now.
I'm so, I don't know what to say. Like, I'm so humbled. But again, I think it stands true to where I come from my perspective, is that if you're seeking something, you've lacked that in life, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where it all came from. And it was like a personal experience that I used to see, a couple of instances happening with a couple of people in my life, and it was always about attention seeking. And I said, I don't think so. It's because there has been some sort of, why do they want attention? Because they're not getting it from, when we say from, it's generally from our primary caregivers. We see the world literally by how we form attachments with them. So
Yeah, it makes sense. It truly makes sense. So when I see a friend of mine who kind of seeks attention, so when I try to dig into like how this person has a relationship with their family, so I kind of like I can gauge like how things might be. So yeah. And the second instance that I thought of you was, so recently I did an episode on like my experience with porn. Like, so I was exposed to porn at a very young age. So I was 10 years old when I saw porn for the first time. I didn't even know what it was. So I did an entire episode of like how, when I say like 10 years, like now I'm 21. So 11 years of my life it has been a part of. So it has been there in the background somewhere. So so I did an entire episode of how my journey was, like how I was transitioning. So so when you told me last time you were here that you dealt with a lot of people in rehab who were dealing with alcohol addiction or any form of addiction, so then I started to think, how different is porn or alcohol or any form of addiction for that matter? So I wanted to have you back and talk about this because like I like that hit me like last time when you said uh,
mhm.
you were here. So I was curious on to like, why do you think like people would gravitate towards things like porn or alcohol?
Right. So I've mostly seen, I've worked in a rehab. So most of my experience comes from, providing therapy to individuals with substance use issues, um, mainly alcohol and hard drugs. So there were modules for other addictions as well, but not a lot of people, especially in India, come in for these problems or concerns. Let's say like gambling. Gambling is also an addiction, right? So the base for all of these addictions, I can say, is the same in terms of what it gives the person, right? I can talk more about how alcohol and drugs, so it's instant gratification that they need,
Hmm.
and it's a very pleasure seeking principle that works behind, right? If you go into very psychological terms, it's their id that's functioning a lot, It's the pleasure-seeking principle of our mind. It is the part of the mind that really seeks pleasure over, let's say, immediate gratification of needs. It has to be immediate. Like I have a craving, I need it to be gone like by now. So it doesn't matter what I'm doing. Like suppose I'm in an interview with you, I don't care. It's when I've agreed to do something like this, I have a certain responsibility to this podcast, right? So if there's something that's really like suppose I just start craving ice cream now, I don't just get up and go leave and get a bowl of ice cream for myself, that's because right now I'm functioning on let's say the ego principle. Ego principle is when it's the reality principle that I have a craving, I can finish this podcast and then I can go get myself ice cream. You get it?
Yeah.
So in that way, I mostly think the behaviors are driven by the id, and so there is a lot of pleasure seeking, and in terms of especially with substances, it's more on the lines of feeling the high, chasing the high. That's the thrill of it, to stay in that state of altered mood, to say. So according to normally people would say that alcohol and hard drugs or alcohol and drugs, but alcohol is also a drug because anything, so like a broad definition of a drug is that anything that alters your mood, right? Anything that has mood altering changes that occur. And so in that way, I feel like I treat all of them under the similar, what do you say?
It comes from the same place.
Yeah. And it's very tricky to work with individuals with substance abuse because there is so first of all, there is not a lot of acceptance sometimes, because especially with alcohol, because there is so much, it's socially accepted. So you can't be addicted to something that's socially accepted. You get it?
Yes, I absolutely get it. Yeah.
So there is that kind of a perception that runs as well with especially with alcohol, and to really get to the base of the base of any addiction, I feel like there are various reasons, and it would be a little let's say, like, I don't want to gravitate too much into the theory of it, but it could be anything from first of all their relationship with their parents, whether they have the range of emotion expression, right? If they have been taught or if they really haven't been taught how to express their emotions. One of the main reasons why people drink or use drugs is because their feelings become unmanageable for them. Guilt becomes unmanageable for them, and so they drink. It works like this: you drink, you feel guilty that you're drinking, so you drink more so you don't feel guilt.
It's a never-ending loop.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle, and acceptance or just insight into this can actually really break the cycle. And so sometimes we don't have different range of coping mechanisms or strategies to deal with a certain issue, and so that can be one of the reasons why people choose to indulge in substances.
Yes, and I think the part that you said about like alcohol being socially acceptable, like that resonates a lot with me because so the only experience that I have with like any sort of like borderline addiction was with porn. Like I've seen my friends who weren't able to function like without it, because like now that a lot of people are talking about porn, like now that everyone's doing it, it kind of gives a feeling that when everyone's doing it, like it's not wrong. Like it gives that perception to it. So I think that like alcohol also being on the same spectrum, I think I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and essentially, I don't think it is wrong. I just think it becomes unhealthy after a point.
Hmm.
You get it? I'm not here to say that anybody who works on a reality principle can always ignore their id, which is the pleasure principle. If you actually ignore your pleasure principle to a point, then your inner child is not really active,
Okay.
right? Because it works in that way as well. So it's not always a bad thing. It's
Hmm.
just it becomes unhealthy when you are unable to manage it, or when that is running your life.
Yeah, when that is dictating your actions or your everyday routine. Yeah, it makes sense. So how much do you think like dopamine plays a part in this? Because a lot of people, this is what I have figured out. I think it's not like a big eureka moment, but I think a lot of people end up watching porn or end up like some form of alcohol uh, or some form of substance is because it's hard for them to suppress the dopamine high when they think of that. Let's say now I have been triggered, I have seen something uh, like a half note picture or something, and then that triggers my dopamine, and then now it gets really hard for me to escape that dopamine and then like suppress that and then come back to normalcy. So even my friend, like he was super into so every time he wanted to drink alcohol, like he would get super excited, so he would have that like dopamine surge, and then it was hard for him to get that excitement down. Like now it's like, now I'm so excited, I don't want to go back to being sad.
So if you had noticed that I'd mentioned about how all of this alters your mood, especially substances, they are mood altering substances, right? And so it of course has an effect on a bodily level, right? um, some people are able to, let's say, have a drink or a two, and when it hits them, they're able to say, okay, I think that's enough for me. Whereas when it comes to individuals who have issues with substances, it becomes hard to stop it at that point, saying, okay, I'm down for two drinks, like I'm done. That stop principle doesn't really exist for them,
Mm.
because it's just one after the other. And by what you're saying is that what I've understood from your question is that why is it difficult to sort of bring it down, the
Yes,
dopamine
yes,
level?
yes.
Okay, so one important thing that happens with any form of, I don't like saying the word addiction, so with any form of, like, when individuals are involved with substances, is that they build tolerance, right?
Mm.
So they start with, let's say, one drink, but since it's like it keeps continuing through the years, you build tolerance, right? So now you can have 5 drinks and just be a little tipsy, and get yourself back home. But with them, once the drinking becomes a regular process, the tolerance becomes much higher. And now, so if I have one drink now, just imagine I have never drank in my life, and I have one drink, I might get buzzed, right? And I will be like, okay, I can't take it anymore. But if I've been drinking for 10 years straight, one drink is not going to have an effect on my brain, because my brain is used to it, right? So I might need one more. But now, if I'm talking about 10 years, then I'm sure I would have developed the tolerance for about a good 6, 7 drinks, right?
It makes
And
sense, yeah.
so imagine that much amount of alcohol is needed to stimulate your dopamine,
Hmm.
right? Um, Also, why it becomes hard to sort of come back to normalcy is because the feel good is too good.
Hmm.
Okay, especially when we're experiencing a crisis, or especially when we're
Oh,
experiencing
yeah.
some sort of difficulties or emotional, psychological pain. When a substance is giving me an easy way to be happy, or let's say liquid happy, um, why would I choose the option of going back to being miserably hopeless?
Yes. It makes so much sense. Yeah.
So again, it comes back to the whole pleasure principle. So the id functions on pleasure principle, which its main aim is to avoid pain.
Mm.
That is the reason why it seeks so much pleasure.
Okay. It's like escaping the pain and then finding other alternatives.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So our mind is going to do that in some way or the other. In healthy ways, it could be rediscovering a hobby when you were a child. Like, let's
Huh.
say you used to paint a lot when you were a child, and that's some sort of, it's giving you some sort of pleasure, and you've quit that as an adult, but suddenly after like 15-20 years you come back to it. It gives you the same,
Joy.
the joy, or the happiness, or the peace, or the excitement, it's the same way. So the main basic um, principle of the id is to avoid pain and seek pleasure. So it will
Yeah.
do that in any way,
Hmm.
because somewhere I feel like it doesn't know what's healthy and what's not. As an individual, you kind of know that in your consciousness as to whether this is helping me or whether this is not helping me.
It's our biases. Like we decide that based on our biases. Yeah. It makes
Yeah,
sense.
and our experience of the world as well. Suppose
Hmm.
I grew up in a family where I have watched behaviors of individuals who have indulged in substances when they have difficult emotions. In fact, without, like, instead of dealing with the emotions, I have seen and been exposed to this.
So it seems
It plays
normal.
a big role. Yeah, because again, I'll tell you one thing. Children will see a million behaviors outside of the house, but they will only pick up the ones that they've seen back at home.
Hmm.
That's how we are wired as individuals. We will always pick up behaviors that can be found back at home.
Yes. And also coming back to your previous point about, so when I drink my first shot, that gets me a certain amount of buzz and I'm high. But as I keep on drinking, my tolerance level increases, right? So now drawing a parallel when it comes to porn, probably when you see like a normal porn, like normal people having sex, and that gives you a same amount of dopamine hit, but as you keep watching, right, like you become desensitized to normal naked bodies. So you want something more exciting. Like you want something just to keep pushing the dopamine high. Like you're becoming desensitized to the normal tolerance level. So it makes
Yeah,
so much
and
sense.
so that becomes your normal, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
It so like I've been trying to like draw parallels to what you're saying to porn, because it's like that has been like my only language of understanding like how this entire thing works. And also talking about normalcy, right? So when I was exposed, the first time when I saw porn, that was in my relative's laptop. Like I was so young, and like one of my cousins, relative's laptop. That was the first time I've seen it, and now that kind of gave me a perception that everybody does it. Like I've seen not just with that one person. Like I've used couple of my other relatives, or like other of my friends, like dad's laptop. Like I've seen this in so many devices. So now to me back then that was like normal. It's like this is an unspoken truth, but everybody does it, so hence it must be normal.
hmm.
So yeah, like it makes sense when you said when kids grow up, like knowing what is normal to them, it gives a sane definition of normalcy.
I can draw another parallel is to, if you um sort of interact with children from war zones or unstable environments. or environments that are extremely threatening to their survival, um, for them chaos is normal, right? It's as normal as every day you wake up and you brush your teeth. You get it? So just like I'm just trying to draw more parallels here,
Yes,
just to
yes, yes.
understand this better.
Yeah. And also, I think that falling into this vicious cycle of this doesn't excite me anymore. So let me dig deeper into that so that it gives me the excitement. And also, even when you're watching porn, right, it's not about watching porn. Like, I figured this out. Since I figured this out, like, my perception entirely changed. I realized it has very little to do with biology. It has very little to do with me being physically attracted to other female. It has more to do with me being excited, like me keeping the dopamine level high. So it's like finding the right video or finding the right category, so that like I know, right, like when I see something and then it's very instant excitement, like you can see the instant spike in dopamine. So and then I search for the thing that keeps me at that level. And so all of my friends that I know, I try to build a really healthy conversation around it, because like friends influence a lot, right, like when it comes to topics like this.
Yeah.
So I've came to the conclusion that everybody face this problem, and this when it comes to porn, it has to do with the dopamine part.
Okay. um I haven't really I'm sure the mechanisms are similar.
Yes, it is like when you're talking about
Yeah.
alcohol, like it was like you were talking to me in that like in my
Yeah.
language of understanding. So like they are like very very similar.
Yeah. And so I think I'm just going to piggyback on my knowledge from,
Yeah, yeah,
dealing
yeah.
with substance
Mhm.
issues, right? But yeah, often it is, again, like when it comes to avoidance, right? Like there is something that is being avoided.
Yeah.
Um, let's say I shoplift something and I'm guilty about it.
Hmm.
And suppose I don't have the means to deal with the guilt, and so now I'm ashamed of it. You get it? Now now shame has come into the circle, and so shame is much bigger. So guilt is shit, I'm doing something wrong. Shame is I am a bad person,
Uh,
right? So now that's entered the picture. So now that's a very very difficult feeling for, let's say, anybody to deal with, but especially when you're growing up, if you haven't um, had avenues to sort of navigate those feelings for you, let's say either in your school or with when it comes to parenting and things like that. If you're not exposed to that kind of awareness, or that these are feelings that do come up, and what happens is that now it's too much for me to deal with, to know that I'm a bad person because I've shoplifted. And so the easiest thing I can do is, that I think that if I drink my problem, if I drink my shame down, I won't remember it. You get it? So I'm gonna have drinks until I pass out, maybe. Okay, and then next day I wake up, and somehow I remember the shoplifting, of course, because that has happened in full consciousness. And so then the shame hits again, or the guilt hits again. Maybe it starts with the guilt again, you know. And now, since I've experienced that this has worked for me this one time, okay, this one time I felt really really uncomfortable in my own body and skin. I have experienced guilt and shame. These are very uncomfortable emotions. That's why I said we've not had avenues to teach us how to navigate through these uncomfortable emotions. And so now that I know this has worked once, you're going to keep doing it for
yeah.
anything and everything that is a little or slightly uncomfortable, or something that could be much more uncomfortable. Let's say later on further in life I lose somebody, I've loved to death. Okay, it could be a family member, it could be anybody, right? And so now I know this sadness and this grief that I'm experiencing is way too uncomfortable for me, right? because right now, again, I'm equipped with avoiding pain and seeking pleasure. That's what I have reinforced through and through in my life. And so again, like I would indulge in this behavior of mine because I know that I can
This
cope with
worked.
it. It's worked for me. Whether it's healthy or not, I'm not saying that, but it has worked, right? But in the long run, it is unhealthy for someone to be coping with their emotions by, suppressing them with a substance. Because at the end of the day, the premise from which I come from, which is, from the DMT perspective of it, which the dance movement therapy perspective of it, it is that the body stores everything.
Yeah.
And so your body keeps an account and a store of everything. And we need to find ways to sort of see, how we can use our body for, our mental well-being and well-being in itself.
Yeah. And also, like you said, when I'm in a crisis and then I want to seek pleasure, the whole point here is to seek pleasure, not to define if this is, not to introspect if this is healthy to me or not. Like, here the only priority is, let me just get the fuck out of the situation I am in here, like, because this is very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And we don't have, I'm not saying we don't, but I feel like as a society in itself, we don't really speak about being mindful about these emotions. I don't remember as a child being taught about guilt and shame, or, let's say for that matter, grief, or anything that's slightly uncomfortable in my body. Let's say irritability, frustration. I don't remember anybody helping me name it until I started studying psychology, and I was like, oh, okay. Until I went to therapy and I said, okay, I'm not experiencing, I'm not completely frustrated. I'm just irritated. There's a difference. There's a difference between guilt and shame. That's the reason why we have different words.
yeah,
And again, it's I'm not saying that it's all bad out there, like the society, but it's just that it doesn't help us equip ourselves as growing individuals, especially when you're growing from being a toddler to an adolescent, that there are a wide range of emotions available to you. And um, each one's going to feel a separate way. And that there are healthy ways for you to cope with these and manage these feelings.
yeah. Yes, it is very, very important, because some people, if they've been ashamed of themselves, or if they're feeling guilty about they, let's say if I am fat, and then if I'm feeling guilty that I am fat, and then so if that translates into like me shaming myself, so, and if if I have this feeling for a long period of time, that means that everything that I do is being dictated from this guilt. So this guilt has been a part of me from so long, and now for me to function without this guilt feels very scary. And
It could feel very disabling. Like,
mm,
I would feel very handicapped. More often than not, in a lot of, let's say, when we talk about poetic references or metaphors, there's always this inner voice that they talk about. When your inner voice has been so critical, it's impossible, like, for you to function without that critical voice, unless and until you have done your reworking and rewiring.
oh yeah,
Uh,
oh yeah,
and this is something that I always believe in. A lot of people use the phrase loosely and literally as well, that they feel broken, and I feel even I have used those terms to describe the way I felt at a certain point. But what I realized is that nobody is ever broken. You are always rewirable. You can always heal, right? And so that kind of perspective really stuck with me, about how you're not broken, you're rewirable,
yeah,
and so again, just taking that of if I'm used to feeling a certain way with this critical voice inside my head all the time, um, how do I again go and do the work for myself? That requires some level of introspection, that requires some level of, insight into the fact that I actually have this voice, and this voice is damaging. This is something that I think I feel like most of us have this inner voice. Sometimes it is a little critical. I faced this too, and I think it's when I went into therapy and I kind of worked on a couple of issues. I realized that inside my head, like when I was dealing with situations that were similar to what I was dealing with before, the voice wasn't about, oh my God, you're not good enough. It was about, it's okay, you might not know everything. Let's try to understand what this is. And so I've seen that personal shift within me. So I know that it is completely possible. As long as you have that insight and the will to work towards it, it is completely possible to change that voice inside, because our voice generally isn't critical. Our innate voice within us.
When you say critical, do you mean negative?
It could be negative. It could be self-defeating thoughts, intrusive thoughts.
Yeah. Especially if the way, if your self-talk, or if, or like you said, the critical thoughts, if they are very unhealthy, right? It is very, very difficult, because now let's say if there is an obese person who has had issues with food and then food addiction, and so if the inner voice is about guilt and shame, like what happens is that this person, the only way this person can get himself to work out is by saying damaging things like, you fat fuck, like you like, oh, you're so fat, like you're so ugly, like you need to go work out. So, oh, you had a donut, so let's so you are starving yourself for the rest of the day. It's like, it's more on a guilt shame punishment, like guilt shame punishment. It's like me working out, the whole motive is not to feel healthy or get fit. It is like a punishment, like it is driven. So when your self-talk is driven by shame and guilt, like the actions are very self-harming and they're very unhealthy. Like, do I make sense?
Yeah. So what I'm trying to understand from what you're saying is that when you're driven by this critical voice inside, that's kind of telling you that you're not good for anything.
Yes.
Your behaviors would always be to sort of immediately and directly tell this voice that, hey, no, this is this, or to sort of agree with it, saying that yeah, I'm good for nothing, I am going to be this obese person. And so especially when it comes to issues with eating, or relationship with eating, when it comes to anorexia and starving yourself, or just not giving, it basically stems from a feeling of not being good enough. You're not good enough to even deserve the meal.
Oh yeah.
Like deep down, it's never about the weight. If you actually talk to anybody who is actually struggling with their relationship with food, it's never about the weight. Of course they will talk everything about that because that's a facade, but deep down it is about much deeper
I don't think even they are aware of that. Like initially when you said about dealing with addiction, like the first part is like awareness and acceptance, right? Like me, like being aware that I have an alcohol problem or I have a food problem. So yeah, like I don't think a lot of people are even aware of that.
Yeah, it takes a while to get to that place of insight, unless and until it does something so damaging to us. Sometimes what happens is that we need physical evidence that it is so most of the people, like let's say most of the clients who would come to the rehab, especially with alcohol, would be older men. Because they have now been diagnosed with liver cirrhosis or a fatty liver, or they've had issues with the heart. and things like that, and the doctor has asked them to stop but they're unable to stop, so the family just brings them in because there's no other way of saving this person, according to them. So then now there's a physical evidence that your drinking has caused, despite the physical evidence, you're not able to stop the drinking. Then it becomes it becomes problematic. With let's say other drugs, it's also because it's not socially accepted. The minute parents find out, they put their children in. So mostly with other drugs, it's younger population that I have seen. Mostly teenage to, let's say, young adults who have come in, because getting addicted to the hard drugs is a little more quicker than alcohol, I feel. Because it's just like, I feel like there is just a different chemical makeup in these.
Yes.
And yeah.
So how do you deal with issues like this? So how do you use dance movement therapy to help people recover from such states?
Okay, so firstly, what I would like to say is that when it comes to most mental health issues, a single approach will not help. It could be helpful, like for some people it will work, for some people it might not. You always need like a multidisciplinary approach, right? So one thing that people often follow, I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's really popular in the West. It's called the AA, the Alcoholics Anonymous. You must have seen it in movies.
I think I've
Or,
heard of it, but I don't know if I'm aware of what it actually is.
Yeah, so it's like a support group, right? But over here in the rehab, so the AA has 12 steps. These 12 steps are basically, the first step is that you have to accept you're powerless over the substance and that it has taken control over you. So it's a like a 12-step procedure where you, like, in the middle of the procedures, you sort of write down all the names of the people you've hurt, and then you go make amends with them, not with the intention of them forgiving you, but the fact that you should make amends, and sort of apologize. So they've got various steps. The 12 steps works brilliantly with, let's say, when we're dealing with substance related issues. But again, 12 steps coupled with different types of therapy is beautiful. It works beautifully, because then I feel like it gives different mediums for the client to pick and choose as to what they are really interested in. Because for some people, AA along with talk therapy would work. For some people, AA along with group therapy would work. For some people, AA with dance movement therapy would work. So it's really to see what works for each individual. Coming to my experience of working, sort of employing the module of dance movement therapy in a rehab, I think it was a beautiful experience to start off with, because there were so many things that the group was exhibiting. For them, it was like, we're going to rebel. But for me, it was about, they're trying to push my boundaries. And this is what they do in general. They push their boundaries every time they drink or every time they use, to that one more drink, one more shot, one more drag, So it's the same behavior that they're exhibiting with me. And so I had to be that container, that beacon to hold this kind of behavior. Why DMT is because I honestly believe that when you use substances, you're used to numbing your body. You're used to numbing your body of its senses, of its feelings. We as humans are very sensory in nature. We get pleasure from things that we can really see. Like, let's say a beautiful scenery, you go to a waterfall or a beach or a mountaintop, or it's very scenic, and so that gives you a sense of peace within, or a sense of calm, or a sense of relaxing feelings. it's the same way. We are such sensory beings, right? We rely so heavily on our senses, and when it comes to issues with substance use, it is actually, so alcohol is like a CNS depressant, like a central nervous system depressant. So it kind of dulls you off your senses, right? And so imagine a body that's been functioning on this dulled senses for years and years, right? You're so far away from your body, which is your home, right? And of course, that's why withdrawals happen. There seems to be such difficulty when you leave the substance, because your body no longer understands the world when you're sober. Your body understands the world only when you're, let's say, high. And so bringing the body back into the picture is a really, really important aspect. Is that to use the body, you use the body to understand and process the feelings that the body is bringing up, the nature of movement that is coming out. It's very, very crucial and important, because if our body is the first place to be affected, let's say when you have a drink, like you said, your dopamine increases, right? If the evidence is so biologically based and so body based, right? Why leave the body out of the question is what I would put forward. Why even look at leaving the body out of it when these substances have a direct effect on your body?
Yeah.
And so that is where I believe DMT makes a huge difference. Movement therapy can really look into understanding the process for you by using your body. It would of course be uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I just cut you off there, but it could of course be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But again, not having the substance in itself is an uncomfortable situation for a person who's dealing with substance related issues. So
okay, so if I'm getting it right, so what are you saying is that when you indulge yourself in a substance abuse for a prolonged period of time, then your body gets physically attached to that substance. So now dance and movement therapy is has to do with a lot of physical movement, right? I am assuming that in a way body gets to talk here. Like sometimes when you talk on a when you go meet a therapist and then you are verbally communicating your problems, it has to do with your thoughts, your mind, right? So like you said, body stores the trauma. So do you think when you are expressing yourself through movement, so maybe all the trauma which is physically stored, do you think like that comes out too, like which the person didn't even know?
Of course. When we're using the creative arts therapies, right? Dance movement therapy comes under one of the creative arts and expressive arts therapies. This deals a lot with the unconscious. So we don't really know what's going to come out.
Okay.
Right? So it is a huge release and some very, very rich data into the person's life. So with dance movement therapy, the person kind of gives their inner world a physical form. When I'm saying, let's just hold up a gesture for, anger. Okay, and I say this for anger. I'm giving a physical form to my anger, right? Also, my energy right now is so much in my hands. Maybe that's where I generally feel my anger as a person. When I say, let's just, find a gesture for happiness, it could be this for me. So just giving it a physical form. So with this physical form, I understand that there's some sort of a up and down motion for me. Whereas in anger, it was so tight and down.
So you relate a certain emotion, you represent a certain emotion physically. is what you're saying, right? Like, can you just take us through, like, what do you, or like, how do you do this? Like, because now a lot of people know how like a verbal therapy works. Like, I go sit and then I talk about it, but I kind of understand what you're saying. Like, you use physical ways to represent your emotion. So, but like, how would you explain it like more deeply? Like, what would you do? Can you just take us through?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, I would say that dance movement therapy is similar to talk therapy, and
Okay.
you put this out very early on in the interview, like in the just now in the conversation, where you said that the body is talking,
Hmm.
and the therapist is trained to listen to the body's voice. Let's simplify it that way,
Okay.
right? And so I am trained to work with groups. I am not trained yet to work individually, so I can talk from my experience of group work, right? So a session, a typical dance movement session, would have a beginning, a development, and a closure, similar to a letter. Let's say it has a beginning, a body, and an ending, right? So the beginning would be really like we would start in a circle. Why a circle? Because a circle is equal, right? I can see everybody equally, and so can they, right? A circle is neutral based starting. So all of these things come into the picture when we're doing movement work and or with creative arts therapies. And so we have different goals for each session. So the goals can vary from body rhythm, body awareness, self-awareness, mindfulness, creativity, various other things, self-esteem, or social skills, interpersonal skills, communication. We have various, goals that we deal with. Uh, and let's say for a session, I take up emotional awareness as my topic for today, let's say. So I have a focus activity which basically allows the participants to bring their entire focus to the session, and then we sort of do a warm up because we're using the body, so we need to do a slight warm up. If I'm only using hands, then I'd rather want to warm up just the hands, right? So we do some activities together to warm it up together, um, it's very like it's not guided, or it's not choreography, it's not steps, it's not performance, although those aspects can be a part of some of the activities. Like sometimes we divide the group into two groups and ask them to come up with their own choreography for let's say the meaning of their names. So suppose my name is Apurva and it means rare. I would have this, so the entire group does this, and then the next person's, like, it goes on, so that there's a group choreography. They have to remember all of it. Suppose it says this and love, like that, so performance is an aspect of it, but it's never the goal. It's a very process oriented form. So then after the warm up, we sort of build into the theme. So if it's emotional awareness, I kind of orient them towards movements or activities that really involve them with thinking about their emotions. We could start off with just, like, let's say a quick body scan and how they're feeling today, and so pick up those feelings and exploring these feelings. The main activity would be to explore these feelings in different parts of the body. So I might call out a name of an emotion, let's say happiness, and I would say one body part, let's say left hand. How would you express happiness in your left hand? So we explored different ways of exploring happiness in the left hand, the right hand, the head, the full body, or legs. So that this is just one activity that I'm giving you an example of. So I would change more emotions, and then I would ask them to really look at how their body is responding to these emotions. If I'm saying that happiness, and then can you express sadness with your right hand? It wouldn't be the same energy that I was just doing this with. It would be more of a downward, let's say, for me,
Slow
a
movement of.
downward, very weak, and for me, it would be a very, downward
Slow,
movement.
lazy,
Whereas
dull
happy was,
movement. Hmm.
yeah, whereas happy would be very, this for me, and so I, as a participant, I would be asked to observe these differences and how your body feels just by doing that. And then right after the main session, we have, like, let's say about 10-15 minutes for just verbally processing what we've come up with today. Just come and speak about your experience, and have a place to hold that experience, because sometimes uh, it, experiences can be overwhelming, because your body, you don't really know what gets triggered when you use your body. And
Hmm.
we sort of close it up with some closure activities, like it could be a ritual that we do together, like a movement ritual or a song together. It could be anything. So that's how a typical DMT session would look like.
Okay.
It would involve various other things, like using props. We use props like balloons, scarves, all sorts of things. Art making. Sometimes finding closure through words can be difficult, so we ask them to sort of put it into art, what they've experienced, put it into art, and then they come and speak about that when they're verbalizing, the experience for them. So that's what a typical dance movement therapy session would look like. Uh, and
So
that's
would
more about,
people end up? So is the whole point is that whatever the inner trauma that they have, they would end up physically expressing it, right? Like, so is this so after a point of time would this be very random and individual? So right now the entire group is trying to express the same thing, right? So at any point would it be that everyone does like random things, like
it could be depending on the activity. Like even in this activity, I would normally ask feelings that are coming up for the group. So each person says one feeling. I would never give out saying happiness or sadness or whatever. Whatever is coming up from the group. Suppose someone says tired, so I'm like, okay, let's use that, because that is what's coming up in the here and now. So I'm going to harness that. Uh, so I'm going to say, let's try taking that experience of tiredness and experience it through our body, right? Somebody else might say they're feeling overwhelmed. Let's sort of take that, and somebody might say they're feeling calm. Let's see how to emote that. So we always work with what the group's need is. So we can't really, like, I can't fully dictate the session or direct the session. And yes, at some point, some activities, so activities can range from either a group activity which the group is doing together. Like, let's say sometimes I introduce a lot of play into my sessions. Like, let's say one game we're playing dodgeball, right? Like, we're just doing dodgeball in the entire group. So it's a very group based activity. Sometimes I divide them into pairs to do some work that is pair related work, right? uh, and sometimes I would do activities that are very individual to themselves. They're not interacting with other people. It's their space and their time to sort of sit with themselves and explore. So there are different constellations that we work with depending on which activity would suit more for like a group. When you're doing social skills, interpersonal skills, group skills and things like that, trust building activities, these all happen with a group.
It makes sense, it makes
Right?
sense.
Yeah. And whereas when I'm working with self-awareness, emotional awareness, I would want to keep it with the individual. Right? Max to max, I would take it to a pair, but not as an entire group. Like, in a way, we're working as a group and we're individually working on,
Yes.
something.
So when it comes to therapy or when it comes to dealing with or any sort of trauma, right? Initially there is this acceptance phase, and then there are different phases to getting out of the trauma. And the first phase is the acceptance phase, right? So I don't know what the second phase is the second phase like working on that, or like what is it? I think there is this like universal thing where there are different phases, different like
Yeah.
acceptance, and then So where do you think this, like, dance and movement therapy, like whatever comes out, where do you think it uh, it falls under? Like, is this like the first phase where they're getting aware of what the trauma is, like, or do you think like it helps with the dealing with the trauma?
So it helps in everything in
Okay.
that way. So for me, like, let's say for me, the start would be to acknowledge, first of all, you know, before I get to accepting, I need to notice and acknowledge that this is what I'm feeling. If I don't have that, then I can't accept it. I can't accept what I don't know, right? And so once I accept, again putting it into sort of action. But uh, I think any form of therapy will involve, it will come in any phase. So sometimes when I'm talking about something, I might randomly notice something else that's coming up for me, you know, and then I acknowledge that, and then I,
Okay.
you know,
Okay. Okay.
accept that part of me, and then I kind of accept and start healing that part of me. It's not always linear. That's why healing is never linear. It's a very uh, you know, it's a very different process. It's all ups and downs and curves, left, right, and center. So uh, yeah, I wouldn't say it's a certain line and that you can fit therapy only in that line. Because suppose I'm a person who has reached that phase of, okay, I want to accept these feelings that I'm having. Let's say I'm going through something, right? I want to accept this, I want to move past it. But while doing that, I might realize something and notice something from, you know, some from another issue altogether, and so that might pop up.
Yeah. So it's so beautiful to know all of this because one of my friend texted me, or like one of a person that I know, after our episode was out. So that person was always curious about, like, she heard what dance and movement therapy was, but she never really knew what it was. So like our episode, like our previous one, gave like a really like interesting informative insight to her. So I think that now like people are getting aware about like all the different means to get better at dealing with their trauma, because everybody has trauma. Like everybody, even though you think that you are like mentally healthy, every single person, like if not like 99% of the people, unless you're a sage living in Himalayas, like 99% of the people have like trauma in them. Like it might not be uh, as severe as others, but everybody still has it, because we are all driven by our insecurities, right? Like everything that we do is driven by it.
Right. And I would agree to the fact that there are quite some parts of a lot of people. I always say this, you know, we are highly unaware individuals walking around in adult bodies.
Mhm.
And we talk about self-awareness, but it's very ironic. And so, yeah, I do agree with the fact that there's a lack of awareness, you know, towards what someone is going through, what you yourself are going through. Um, and that becomes a difficult place to navigate from, and so the only way is to spread awareness about it, so
Yes.
in that way, you know, however possible. um, it's an altogether different conversation when I kind of bring in schools and stuff, because I feel like educational institutions really have to encourage more conversations around mental health, around sexual orientation, gender fluidity. These are some things that an educational institution has the power to give the right kind of information to children.
At a young age especially, like that's the
Yeah,
crucial part of their lives, right? Yeah, I think the like we need three uh, crucial educations in crucial subjects in our education system. One being sex education, like really sane sex
yeah,
education, and the second one would be like you said, like a mental health, a mental like self awareness, sort of education, and the third would be financial education. Like I believe these three should be prominently be in our school education
Yes.
system.
Yes. Nobody ever tells you how to save. I feel like you learn that from your parents or like, somebody like who's, uh, I would, because I am somebody who's really bad with the banking system. Like I don't understand these terms at all. Like everything goes above my head, right? And so I always need someone. Like if I have to go to the bank, it's a very very frightening experience for me. Like I physically hate going to the banks because first of all such slow procedures, and that makes me even more anxious. And when I go to the counter and then they say there's some mistake, that makes me even more anxious, so I have to go back and like I think that gets me very very
Yeah,
like I
because you might lose your money, right? Like that fear is always because it's money, or what if I lose it, like just because I did some error. So it also like drives that anxiety.
yeah. And it's just, like for me, I don't think I've ever been a person who handled money in a very like I feel like I didn't know how to handle money. Trust me, like if someone gives me a lot of money, I'll be like, how do I keep this safe? You know, like even in college, when you have to go pay your own fee, right? In school, it's your parents will come at the office, pay and go. But in college, it's a different scene where you have to go pay your fee, and like there's no parent involved. And the day when I have to go and pay the fee was the biggest problem for me. Not because you know like my parents would just give me the money and they'd be like, okay, go take it. Like, go pay it up. And my biggest thing is, how do I safeguard this much amount? Like, like I would give it to one of my friend who's really good with finances. Like, she's very well versed with banks and stuff, right? And so she would always be like the person to go to with like finances. So I would like the minute I would reach college, I'd be like, listen, keep the money, it's with you. Okay. And like I think that's how I have never been oriented towards handling finances, or being comfortable with finances, or even like in the beginning of my career, like to ask let's say money for how much I was working was also such a big difficulty for me. And I feel like what you said was financial education is so important to understand how to save money. Uh, of course, back then, if you would have told me save money, I would have been like, no, no, I'm going to splurge it. I want to
Yeah.
do trips with my friends and all of that. But at least later on, when you actually have the plan to save money, you're well equipped.
Yes. I was on my friend's podcast and we had a entire podcast. We talked about like wealth, money, how are these two different? Why is it important to give a really sane perspective of how to create wealth and not run after money, like all the asset building, all that. So yeah, that was when like we kind of figured out in the conversation. Plus we never really grow up, right? Like recently I've figured out this. So when I was a kid, I thought going to college was like you're an adult. Like when you go to college, like usually when you see movies, it's like there is this hero, he falls in love with the heroine, and then he's a college student, and he fights away all the goons. So it's all the adult stuff, right? And now I like 10 days back I finished my final exam, and I'm done with my bachelor's. So I still feel like I'm still a kid, like who's trying to grow up. Like now, I think that when I look at my parents, also they are like 40-year-old kids. Like I think you never really grow up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. First of all, congratulations on finishing your bachelor's.
Thank you so much.
But I kind of resonate with what you're saying over there. I thought like when I get to college, I would feel like an adult. Because when you have hit your 18th birthday or your 21st birthday, there's a special milestones, right? Um, I thought I would feel like an adult when I was 18, but I still felt like a child. I thought 21 is it. I was always a mature person, like, but that side of me only comes out when I'm having emotionally vested conversations. I'm emotionally invested in these conversations. But otherwise, if somebody sees me, they would really think I'm just a goof, because I'm just all over the place. I'm always like really hyper and happy, and I have my own like weird. Like when I meet people, I just really love the energy of people, and so yeah. And then I thought, okay, if I finish my bachelor's, I'm gonna feel like an adult. Then masters, I was like, okay, now after masters, I'm gonna get a job, so then I'll be an adult. No, I still don't feel like an adult, and of course there are some like in ways that I look at my life like, okay, now I have a career, now I have this, I'm doing all of this. In some ways I do feel like I'm doing some of the adult things in life, like adult responsibilities of just have a career going on and things like that. But otherwise I just sometimes feel really really like a helpless child, like I just want to go out and play, or just give me a PS4, I'll be happy.
I think that you, like someone younger than you might see you as an adult, but you never see yourself as an adult. Like
Yeah, it's true.
right now I can go like after 21 years old, I can go get married. I can own a real estate property. I can literally own a home. Now thinking about that, I'm like, that's such a huge responsibility to me. I can never imagine myself actually owning a real, like actually owning a home, and then that feels like such a huge responsibility, right?
Yeah, it does. Like, funny story. When I hit 18, I was so ready to get married. I was I always believed a lot in like the institution of marriage. So I would really go and tell my mom every day, I'm ready to get married. I'm ready to get married. And my mom and my dad always came from the thinking that, you have to get married a little later on in life, not too early. Like 18 is too early for you. Around 25 we'll see. And now that I'm 26, I'm like, damn, no, like I don't think I can handle it, at this point. It's not that I can't, I'm not ready for it. I think I was always ready for it as an individual. But when I think about me wanting to get married when I was 18, like I feel so stupid.
Yeah,
You
I think
know?
that when you
But
think you're an adult, you're not actually an adult. But when you think you're not an adult, I think that's when you're an actual adult. So it's
yeah,
like
I
even
think you
when I
put
was
that up very
18,
correct.
yeah, like even when I was 18, I used to feel like I'm such a grown up. Like now I can do whatever the fuck I want. Like, like I used to walk around with that pride. Like I am adult. Like I know what I'm doing. Like even when you're arguing with your parents, you're like, like I'm actually growing up. Like,
Yeah.
that, right? Like, so
Stop.
it's like, yeah. Like now I feel more kiddish than I ever felt in my life.
Yeah, and of course, like I think these are like phases. I feel
Yeah.
like you go through it, and then you like at one point you're like, okay, I feel like I've made it as an adult, but then suddenly, but like personally, I've never felt the need to behave like an adult, not be an adult, to behave like an adult. Um, I just I don't know. That's not truly uh, who I am. But again, like even at this age, I feel I'm talking like I'm really old. I'm not. But yeah, so even at like 26, I feel so enthusiastic about life. Like, you know, I'm just like, oh, I want to see this, oh, I want to do that. Like, the energy and enthusiasm is so real. And I think a lot of a lot of the definitions of adult life are so skewed and so biased. Like, oh, if you're an
Yeah.
adult, you have to do this only, and you have to be so serious, and you have to be like, you can't have fun
No,
in life. There's no time for
I
fun.
think that was our parents' generation. Like now we are literally adults. Like me and you, like we are like sort of adult. Like you are, and I think I am sort of like I'm gonna be 22. So like now that we are like this, like our definitions is gonna change. Like probably like our kids are gonna see us as like 30-year-old teenagers or something, like when they grow up.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
You never know.
Plus, the other thing that I always, I'm so fascinated is that this is why I always feel like I've never really grown up, is because I still feel like I carry certain trauma, like my childhood, like bad incidences. I still carry them with me. So I actually dated a girl when I was in my seventh grade. Yeah, like that. That's when I got into a relationship with a girl, and then that lasted for like 5 to 6 years. So like most of my like teenage life, I was very much attached to that person. And then like it ended when I was in my 12th, like when I was about to come to college. So it ended then. So now when I look back, like sometimes let's say like some movie scene or like some experience someone's talking about, it triggers the memories that I had with that person. So it's like that was such a long time ago, like 5 years back or something, but it still feels like I'm experiencing in that moment, like the pain. So yeah, like we all carry such like childhood trauma with us. So
That's the interesting thing about the mind, you know. Um, it has the power to really bring something to life uh, from the past, but also help us visualize a certain scenario. Like when I say just close your eyes and visualize something that really brings a sense of calmness to you, you're able to do that. uh, and I think that's the reason why the mind is such an important and interesting uh, aspect.
it is truly interesting. The other day, so I was so depressed when my relationship ended. I don't know if you can literally call that a relationship, because like you're not associated technically, like you're not engaged or something. So but like when that ended, I was so depressed. Like my parents got involved there, like they were trying to console me. So the other day, my mom reminded me of that. Like we were having this conversation. Like, do you remember, like back when like you were so sad, you were so depressed? And then my mom told she was feeling sad about something. And then I tried to tell her something, but then she told me, "See, you were kid back then, but like you felt so bad. Like now this is a different thing." Like she kind of uh, so I'm trying to frame this properly, because uh, she kind of didn't take that seriously, because like I was a kid and then you felt like so bad. She didn't take that sorrow very seriously, if that makes sense. It's like you were a kid, you didn't even know. Like when you were a kid, if you felt like so bad, can you imagine like how bad we might have felt now? uh, so she was feeling
Yeah,
bad about something. Do I make sense?
yeah. She was just yeah, I got what you're saying.
Yeah. So, but I told my mom that, see, when a kid is happy, that happiness, if I am happy, the level of the emotion is the same regardless of what the situation is. Now, let's say if I was
Yeah.
sad back then and if I'm sad now, the intensity is still the same. Like I cannot disregard my previous incidences just because I was young.
Yeah, of course. What you feel is always valid.
Hmm.
Whatever you feel, be it to any degree, it's always valid. And there is no, there's no comparing it to anything else or anybody else. Because um, like when you grow tall, no, like when you're in your school, you grow tall, like you measure. Like I used to have this thing where we used measure, okay, every birthday and like important days, we just like measure, me and my brother. um when we grow tall, like we are not measuring our height with somebody else's height. Like it would be stupid for me to measure my height with my brother's height. It would only make sense if I measure my height with my own height, like how what I was when I was in 2012 to
Absolutely.
2015, right? And so I think that should sort of be applied to
Yeah, and also a lot of people just disregard their like what their kids feel just
They
because they're young,
minimize.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. They think they don't remember, but that's the thing. Your body remembers. Um, there is so much about the body that um, there are times when you have a gut feeling, or and it's so right, like it's so right that you're like, oh damn, I knew that this is right. So these are the ways in which your body talks to you, you know uh, and your body will remember because it's storing actively and passively, you know and so it's not about the memory of it, because the mind is a very beautiful interesting thing, like I said before, is that the mind has the capacity to erase something that is supremely hurtful.
Or alter certain memories, right? Like how you
Yeah,
want it to be.
yeah. Like if you see, when you're denying something, you're basically denying the reality of it. Suppose I lied to you and I get caught in this whole thing, and I said, no, I didn't lie to you. Remember what I'm trying to tell you. Like I told you this, I'm not saying that. It's hard for me to accept the fact that I said something that is not true. So I'm going to deny it, right? And so our mind uses different ways to protect us from pain um,
Makes sense.
when it thinks it's too much. So it uses mechanisms that really help us to cope with things, uh, uh, and it is basically protecting us from that kind of experience. Even when you say, like, of course I do understand where you're coming from when there are experiences of parents minimizing or disregarding what the child has gone through, or instead they will share an instance about them
Oh
that has
yeah.
been way more severe. uh,
That's
you
so
know
Indian parentish.
yeah, like I'm not too sure if it's just Indian, but
Oh yeah.
like I think it's just a very like unaware parenting, I feel, because like I said, just unaware individuals in adult bodies walking
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. I think when we start looking at people like that, right? Everybody, like even your parents or your brother, anyone that you look up to, they are not perfect. Like everyone is derived, like everyone is carrying trauma with them. So don't keep someone on a pedestal because they'll end up falling, or they will have to lie to you, keep you in denial so that they maintain that, so that they stay on that pedestal. It's wrong even for us to put them on that pedestal. So you usually we keep parents there, right? Like we keep parents
True,
are like
true.
our ideals. Like
They
we have.
can't be wrong.
Yeah. So I think we need to, if we start looking them as they are also people who are growing, they're still kids who are growing. They also have flaws. Like we'll have a really healthy environment around us.
Your outlook, of course, will matter a lot, because I see that a lot of the aspects come into play when you really understand that they are also human. They also hurt the same way. They are equally as clueless as you are sometimes for some situations. And that's completely okay. When you kind of put that perspective into your head, you become more empathetic. Empathy doesn't mean you sit and fuel them. You get it? That you enable this behavior within them. Empathy means that you understand that they might not be mentally capable of making that kind of decision for themselves, right? And so just being aware that they're also flawed, they also make mistakes, because most of the times what happens is that as children, when you talk to children, it becomes very difficult for them to know that that their parents have faltered. Like, they're supposed to be my parents, they can't do this, you know. It becomes a very black and white situation when it comes to parents,
And
either
also
they're good or they're bad.
mostly the way parents talk is they always bring themselves into the picture, right? They always say that I never did this. See, I was always better as a kid. So I think that they in like the way how they say things, it kind of embeds in their head that my parents are better than me or better than who I am. So I always have to look up to them and I always have to try to be them. So if parents change the way how they uh, uh, tell their kids,
Communicate.
communicate their flaws. Let's say if a kid did something wrong, the way how you communicate is gonna frame this kid for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
So yeah, like now we all grew up, like we all have come to a point where even though like now I can recognize my parents flaws, like even though my parents were flawed, like any parents are flawed, now we have a choice here to make, to just have a different perspective over them.
Right. Right. And what you said about just, how you communicate changes everything for the child. Um, that's when I kind of bring in this point about having honest and genuine conversations. Um, and it's okay for parents to tell children that they don't know about something. Get what I'm saying? Sometimes I
Yes.
might not, as a parent, I might not be able to understand what my child is going through. And so for me, it is, as a parent, it is my, let's say, responsibility to help them go through it, but also tell them that I might not understand what you're going through completely, but I'm here for you. To let them know that this is a space where you can freely explore your emotions, freely explore who you are, who you want to be, and that kind of honest conversations can get stuck by power dynamics and control and things like that. Of course, I understand, but there are many systems that really contribute towards not having these honest conversations. Again, but I feel like our generation is something that it's a very, very unique generation, because I see so many people having similar problems that I have. When I say, oh my God, that's so misogynistic of you to say that. And if I point out something that is slightly misogynistic, I can see a lot of people relating. That means we are a generation that's really undoing some generational trauma. We're trying to heal. And so
Yes.
we have that kind of insight and awareness to understand that the world can function differently.
It's so interesting you say, you talk about generational trauma, because I heard this story someone say on their podcast as I was listening to their podcast. So a mom, mice. So before she gave birth, she was always electrocuted. Like there are these machines where you can taser them, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's like the mom was tasered for a prolonged period of time, and then when the mice gave birth, so and when these scientists or whoever were conducting this experiment, when they placed the taser, the mice would just run away. Like the kids, they would run away from the taser, like they didn't even know what it was, but they were so scared of it. So the trauma was transferred, like generational trauma, like it keeps transferring. Like now let's say
Yeah.
depression or let's say anxiety, like if you're feeling something, it is a generational thing that you might be carrying, like that was not
Yeah.
necessarily had to do anything with your childhood.
Yeah, that's what I mean by when I say sometimes, we're carrying often burdens that are not ours. Sometimes when we truly come to understand what we really are dealing with, our problems really seem more manageable because they're our problems and not somebody else's problems. Most often, we are carrying problems from our previous generations, projections that have feelings that have been really projected into us. You know.
Yes. So I when people should have a different outlook on getting help, the people would get help to become more healthy, not because they're sick. So whoever's listening to this, or like I want a lot of people to have a different outlook on life, because last time when you were here, I took away a few points which I still remember and I will remember for the rest of my life. So I would be I would be happy if whoever's listening, they take certain points from this, like the way how they view their parents or the elderly. They are also growing, like they are older version of kids. So let's be more empathetic. So I hope people like they had fun listening to us, because I had so much fun uh, talking to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a fun conversation when I'm having a conversation with you. So thank you for having
You're
me the
so,
second time.
yes, I would love to have you back sometime in the future, because you're so positive. Like I love talking to you. Last time you were here, uh, like after our call ended, like after the podcast was ended, like I was so happy. I was so positive. Like my friend, like literally noticed that, and so yeah, like I'd love to have you back sometime.
I really appreciate you sharing that with me. It really means a great deal to me. And yeah, it's been such a good experience. Like every time I come on this podcast, even I take away so much, you know, to sort of understand how things are in, let's say, somebody else's perspective. It's so beautiful to watch for me. It's so beautiful to witness, and to have a conversation around something that's so let's say important, at least to the both of us. I think it feels really it's very empowering for me to have these conversations and come out and talk about the things I love, and you creating an avenue for it. So it's always a very empowering experience for me.
This is the reason why I do what I do. Like I don't like really care about like how many people, like the numbers, like how many views or how many people watch it. But there is so much that I learn from this, and there are a few people who regularly listen to my podcast. They listen to the entire thing. So I know that there is a lot of things that we don't speak in society. Like it's like high time we bring a sane and healthy view over certain topics. Like people can seek help to become like more healthier version of themselves. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it was lovely having you. Thank you so much.
A Sankarshan Joshi trip.